Let me tell you just a little bit about myself as to why Jerry wanted me to talk. So I have had a wide variety of marketing and advertising roles. I've been a communication consultant. I've helped and led communications for development campaigns. I've been the board member on a Christian camp and on the advancement committee, been on an advisory board. I've worked for companies as small as 11 and worked for multinational companies that have 125,000 employees. I've been the global marketing director for a company that worked on 6 continents. And right now I'm currently, among one of my roles, I'm the president of the Author Learning Center, which is what you'll see in my profile. And the reason why I wanted to start here is because no matter what you're doing, no matter where your ministry is at, I can tell you that the principles that I'm going to share with you, I have seen work in a variety of settings and in a variety of organizations, small organizations, large organizations, not-for-profits, ministries, and big corporations. All have benefited from the principles I'm going to share with you. And so what I'm confident of is what I'm going to tell you today are things that you can immediately begin to apply to make yourself much more effective in your communications. Now, one of the things that I think you'll find unique about this, because one of the challenges often for ministries is marketing is often thought of too much of bringing the world into the ministry. And it's also thought of as being manipulative. But the reality is effective communication is the foundation for all relationships. If you think about it, whether it's marriage, children, parents, business, effective communications makes all relationships work. And I believe that we should be the best communicators and designers as a matter of stewardship. God has given us a call, particularly each of you, to do a particular ministry. But as part of that stewardship, you need to communicate to people what that is so that they can join you in that work. So what I want to share with you today is some principles that will help you do that. And it's key here because I'm not going to just give you a bunch of tricks and tips. It's principles that you can apply over a long period of time that will make you much more effective in communicating what God has called you to do. And we're going to look at it in 2 quick buckets. One is the message that you're going to convey. And the way we're going to talk about that is actually most marketing communications is simply making and keeping a promise. And then the second thing we're going to look at is the media and how you communicate a promise. Both of those things are really key to understand to be even more effective in your communication. So let's start with the message. So your message is simply, what do you say? And I want you to think of your marketing and communication as simply making and keeping a promise. If you step back for a moment, this is a key in all relationships. And too often when you think of marketing communication, people think of tricks and tips and things like that. But in the end, all relationships are built over time by making and keeping a promise. All relationships are sustained based on this interaction. So when you make a promise, though, what's important is you want to say something that's compelling, differentiating, and true. Compelling, differentiating, and true. Those are 3 very key words. Compelling is important because you want to say something that motivates people to action. And we're going to talk about what you can do to help them take action. The second thing you want to do is say something that's differentiating. What makes your communication and your organization distinct than others? And I will tell you that this is a challenge in a lot of ministries because they feel like they're quote unquote looking at the competition, or they feel like they're not being humble. But actually, I'd like you to think about it slightly differently today. I'd like you to think about it as, what is the unique call that God has given you to do to help build his kingdom? And so communicating that is very important because people want to understand what happens if you go away, what doesn't get done, and we'll talk about that. And then the last thing, which seems obvious, but it's important, and whatever you say, it needs to be true. And the reason is because if I'm going to make a promise to you about what I'm going to do, and I engage in a relationship with someone, I want to make sure that the promise actually is fulfilled. And that's how I sustain a relationship over time. So each of those things is important: compelling, differentiating, and true. Then the other thing we want to look at is, what's the distinction between benefits and features, right? A benefit is what, a feature is what you're about, or a fact about your organization. But the benefit is what you do for them or make them feel based on who they are as a person. Now, each of these things, I'm going to give you some principles that you can use to make sure that your messages are compelling, differentiating, and true, and that you actually speak about benefits, not just features, because features are about you and benefits are about what impact you're going to have in the life of people. So the second thing you need to understand about messages is you want to understand the 3 intrinsic motivations that drive decisions. This is a really key thing because oftentimes when we communicate with people, we're not thinking about what are the things that tip them towards taking action. And what I've learned over all my years of doing marketing communication for the last 40 years in all kinds of organization is people generally have 3 motivations, no matter what purchase decision they're making, no matter what decision they're making about giving to something. They're trying to solve a problem, reach a goal, or achieve an aspiration. Those 3 things are the things that drive people towards making a decision. So you want to express your message as to how you help them solve the problem, reach a goal, or achieve the aspiration. And I'm going to show you some examples at the end of how these things actually play out. But understanding what those motivations are of your audience is really, really key. And oftentimes when I work with teams, what I tell them to do is don't write a brochure, don't write an ad, don't write an email. Write down for me your audiences and now describe for me the problem they have, the goal they're trying to reach, or the aspiration they have. And then you can start to communicate, because when you understand how they're looking at the world and what you're going to do for them, then they are ready to engage in you. And this is important. Having a favorable opinion of something or thinking it's a good idea is not enough. What I've learned through actually a number of failures is that you can do focus groups and people will think very positively about what you're offering or think very positively about your ministry. They'll think well about it, but that's often not enough to drive them to make a decision if you don't understand what problem they're trying to solve or goal they're trying to reach or aspiration they have. So these are very, very critical things before you ever write anything or before you ever communicate anything, is to think about these things. Now, I'm going to show you 2 different categories. I'm going to show you 2 different headlines of how these things get applied. 2 examples are from the marketplace and 2 of them are ministry examples. So one of the companies that I had a privilege of working with a number of years ago was RCI. It's the world's largest timeshare exchange company. Depending on where you're at in the world, you may be familiar with timeshare, but basically what it is you don't own a vacation condo, you own a week at a vacation condo. And RCI basically set themselves up as a marketplace to exchange the condo that I own in Colorado for a week that maybe a condo Jerry owns in Florida for a week. And so when we started working with them, they were basically promoting themselves and communicating that they have more timeshare exchange opportunities than anybody else in the world. Now, what's important about that is that's true. They're much, much larger than any competitor. But it fails to understand the promise that they're making to people and why people are choosing them. And so as we worked with their customers and began to understand, what we realized is the reason why people came to them is because they wanted to make memories with the people that they loved. And this gave them more opportunities than they had in other traditional ways. So we started changing their headlines and their communication to, are you ready to make some memories with the ones you love? Now, eventually we talked about we have more opportunities and more things to do, but you can see the difference between the first one, which is a feature about them, and the second one, which is a benefit to the people who are part of it. Author House is a company that I work with right now, and this is a company that does self-publishing. And so when I first started working with them, it says, we help you get published. But what we changed it to is, imagine holding the first copy of your book in your hands, because that's the aspiration. People weren't just worried about getting published, they were worried about getting the book in their hands. And then here's 2 more examples. The LCMS Foundation, with the Lutheran Financial Legacy Planning Management Group, their headline was, realize your vision for mission and ministry. And we changed it to, provide for the people you love and the ministries you can care about. And I'll tell you about, and I'll show you examples of that in a little bit. And then lastly, the Crisis Pregnancy Centers, which some of you are very familiar with. They started a development campaign around the theme of Campaign for Life. And what we did is we worked with them to understand that actually the Campaign for Life wasn't as important as what they would do as a result of that, which was there would be 2,400 babies saved as a result. Later on, I'm going to show you the actual examples of both of those and how they played out in layouts as well too. So let's move on and think about the message in one more aspect. And this is perhaps my favorite part of what we do when we think about the message. And that is, you need to apply the takeaway, okay? The takeaway is, say your ministry does not exist, what would be lost or what would not get accomplished. So it's very easy for us to think about what happens if our ministry exists, but what happens if all of a sudden tomorrow you disappeared? And this should align with your mission and vision, but this exercise makes it clear what people get from a relationship from you that they can't get anywhere else. Now, this is very much a US illustration, and I apologize if this doesn't work completely in all the European countries, but when I've made this presentation in the past, and Jerry knows this, I started probably 15 years ago using Kmart and Walmart as an example. And I said, if I took Kmart away, what impact would it have in communities in the US? And the answer was always, it wouldn't change a thing. And sure enough, Kmart is out of business. But Walmart, if it went away, would be a significant loss. And so this is very, very important, because you want to try and make a promise or convey a message that isn't just about your categories. So when I think about the category of missions, a lot of times people will cite the Great Commission. Well, that's true for everybody. But the thing you need to do is try to understand, what do you do that no one else does? Who do you serve that no one else does? And that becomes very important for you as well too. Okay? So those are the three key things of the message: making a promise, understanding what the key intrinsic motivators are of your audience, and applying the takeaway. And now what I want to talk about is the media and how you say it. Okay? So this is something that impacted me years ago. This is a verse in Genesis 2:9, and it's very, it's been there all the time. It's one of those things I talk about as hiding in plain sight. But I was taken by this verse that said, out of the ground the Lord God made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Another translation says pleasing to the eye, useful and pleasing to the eye. And I just thought, wow, why did God decide to just make an apple look good? Why didn't he just make it taste good? And then as you begin to trace the idea of design throughout the Bible, you realize it's a high priority in the kingdom of God, starting in Genesis and ending in Revelation, when the specific requirements are given for the New Jerusalem. So you want to be able to make sure that as you're thinking about design, you realize that this is a high priority in the kingdom of God. So here are two things that you can think about from a design standpoint that can make your communications more effective. You want to use photos, images, and captions. We are an image-driven culture, and we don't skip captions. Now, in the West, almost all children's books, if you think about it, are basically an image and a caption. So from the very earliest point in our life, our minds are trained to read images and captions. And if you are not using the right images and you're not using captions, you're missing perhaps one of the best opportunities to communicate your message. So your photos and captions should tell your whole story, because that may be all that people read. And so when you think about your photos and you think about your captions, you should think about them very, very strategically. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how that can work. When you write your captions, don't just describe what I can see. Don't tell me what I can see in the photo, but use the photo or use the image as a way to convey a benefit or convey the impact that I'm going to have as a result of the ministry I'm going to do. And don't just tell me what I should think or feel. Provide the stimulus for them to come to that conclusion. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a moment as well, too. One of the key things to remember about communication is there's a principle called stimulus response. And stimulus means that I'm going to give you something to elicit a particular response. So if I said my goal is to make Jerry happy, I could say, Jerry, I'm going to make you happy. You're going to be so happy you won't believe it. Or I could just not say anything and give him a $100 bill. And guess what? Jerry would be happy. And so you always want to think about what stimulus you're giving to elicit the response that you want. So let me show you a couple examples. I had mentioned that I'm on the board of a camp in northern Wisconsin. It's called Fort Wilderness Ministries. And so these are actual images that we use to recruit summer staff to work at camp and work with kids. And so what's important here is if you look at the left-hand side, these are Facebook images and Instagram images, which is, again, a really important part for the kids. But the image is of a bunch of people having fun and enjoying each other. Now we could say, hey, if you work on Fort staff, you'll have a lot of fun and make friends. Or you can just show this picture of crazy kids doing a lot of stuff and say effective teamwork and have a simple call to action. And then on the other side, you'll see a young man working with a bunch of young kids. And again, proof that unicorns are real because he's got a silly hat on. But look at the kids smiling and look at the things that they're doing. So if you want to work with kids and kids are an important part, maybe you're an education major, man, that looks like a lot of fun. So it's an example of where you take an image and you don't have to tell them what they see. And you don't have to tell them what they feel as a result of this. You just give them the image, give them a caption, and it helps them understand what they can do as a result. Now, here's a couple other ones I want to show you. And this is something I would greatly encourage you to do. This actually comes from surveys that were done from campers. And so, again, very different images, but these are actual quotes. So the one on the left side was, I was able to talk to my mom about some of my struggles and hurts growing up. This is from a family camper. And so what's interesting about this is if you're a mom and you have teenage children and you're not having a chance to communicate with them very often, what this tells you is that Fort Wilderness is a place where your kid might open up their private world to you. And then the one on the other side is I was reminded and given the opportunity to sit quiet and be with God. So if you're living a very hectic life, feeling disconnected from God, both of those just give you the sense that, wow, Fort is a place. Now, I could make a statement in the right-hand side and say, Fort is a place where you can connect with God, or I can just let these words convey that same thing. So oftentimes what I've seen, and I see this in our current business, is if we survey, people write things in the surveys if they've had a great experience that are far better than anything myself or my marketing team could ever come up with. And so I really learned to use what people say in a way that conveys things. And the one on the left speaks to a mother's heart, and the one on the right speaks to someone who's just living a busy, disconnected life. And so these are just simple examples. And the reason I show these is because you don't have to get very elaborate. If you just do this over a consistent period of time, I think you'll find that you can make that happen. So, and then the last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of media is you want to make your call to action clear. So this is perhaps one of the hardest things I think for people to do, and that is, what is the one thing you want me to do as a result of reading this communication? Do you want me to give? Do you want me to sign up for a newsletter? Do you want me to submit an application to fill out to join staff? What is it you want me to do? And this oftentimes takes some debate and discussion. It doesn't mean you can't give people alternatives, but you want to give them the one thing to do. And this is, and Jerry will probably love this, don't be afraid to ask. One of the things that I've seen over the years is sometimes people are hesitant in asking, but actually what I've learned over the years, particularly when it comes to development, that God has put on the hearts of some people generosity, and they're not afraid to give. What they're afraid of is they want to make sure when they stand before God and they give account for the resources he's given them, that they've given in a way that honors him and gets the best return, as the parable of the talents talks about. And then I'm going to show you two different emails, and I want you to see the difference between the two. This is very simple. This is actual a business that we operate for Reader's Digest, but you'll notice that the layouts are almost identical. But there's one big difference to the one on the right. There's a big button on the bottom that says download your free publishing guide. Now, in this case, these two emails ran to the same email list, and the one on the right generated 150% more response than the one on the left. And I would tell you that the difference is simply that there's a very, very clear call to action. Now, you don't have to follow this layout, but in your communication, you should make sure that you know what your layout is going to do to help people understand what their call to action is. And then when you look at your call to action, you want to say, what can you do to make it better? And you want to make sure you include the benefit. So one of the things you don't want to do is put the words get more information. People have all the information they need right now. They're overwhelmed by information. So this is a real simple thing, but I'm going to go back to this. Notice that what the button says. It says download your free publishing guide. What's the benefit of me hitting that button? Well, I'm going to get a free publishing guide. So when you write your call to action, write it as a benefit. When they take that step, what are you going to give them? Are you going to give them an annual report? Are you going to show them how God is working in your country? Whatever it is, don't just say get more information or click here or something like that. I can tell you that by including the benefit, it also will increase the opportunity for people to respond. And as I said, don't be afraid to ask. Be clear about what you want to do, but don't be afraid to ask. Now, that doesn't mean you have to only have one call to action. In a lot of our businesses, we have the call to action that says download a free publishing guide, but we also said, or if you prefer, you can call. But you really want to think through what's the one thing that you want to do to make sure that they engage with your, with your communication. All right, so here's another set of questions that we'll talk about in the breakout sessions. You want to apply the takeaway. You just ask a simple question. If tomorrow your ministry completely went away, what would be lost? And one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, if we went away and what would be lost, could anyone else fulfill what we're doing right now that no one else is doing? And then the second thing is for you to look at your layouts and say, are you using photos and captions as effectively as you could? I can tell you in all the years I've been doing this, most organizations just don't do this very well because they don't really think about it as an opportunity. They just think about it as filler. And actually most designers don't think about that in this way. But I'm telling you, photos and captions can be one of the most effective things that you can do to tell your story. And then do you have a clear call to action in your communication when it's needed? So even on the ones that I showed you on Fort Wilderness about staff, there was a URL that you could click on to apply for staff. So a very simple statement, very clear image, and then one clear call to action. And not having that call to action is a mistake that a lot of organizations make it as well. So I realize in some respects I'm giving you a lot to talk about or to think about here, but all of these things are principles that you apply over time. So before we go to our breakout, I'm going to show you some examples of these principles at work. And then we're going to go to our breakout sessions in just a moment. So I had mentioned earlier the headlines for the Crisis Pregnancy Center of Central Indiana. And I want to give you a little bit of a background here. I think you're familiar with Crisis Pregnancy Centers. They are organizations that help young women who have pregnancies that are unplanned or maybe unwanted. And Crisis Pregnancy Center steps in to make sure that those babies do not get aborted. In our community, it's been a significant organization and ministry. They actually now are rebranded as Life Centers. But years ago, they were about to embark on a capital campaign. And a board member of theirs suggested to their executive director that he should talk to me and just let me evaluate what they were doing. So at the time, they'd actually gotten pretty far down the road and they were about to launch a campaign called Campaign for Life. So I actually, with their permission, have always included these layouts. This is what they were doing, Campaign for Life. Life hangs in the balance, time counts. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but let me tell you what the purpose of the capital campaign was. At the time, they were going to raise $3 million. And the reason is because at their current run rate, they could open one center a year over like a 6-year period or an 8-year period. But if they raised $3 million, they could double the number of centers they were opening each year. So instead of opening one, they could open 2. So at the end of the time period, they'd have double the centers. And so as we applied these principles, we said, okay, Campaign for Life, that's not bad. And as I pressed on the takeaway and pressed on some of these things, what's the difference between opening centers and not opening centers? And the reality is they had the stats that showed that for each center, there's a certain number of babies that they intervene in their lives for, and there's a certain number of people that they have to share they have the opportunity to share the gospel. So the Campaign for Life became the Miracle 2400 campaign, a strategy to save the lives of 2,400 babies and 888 souls. And then the question became, what would you do to save 2,400 babies' lives? So again, Campaign for Life, nothing wrong with it, but not very compelling, not very differentiating and true. And this became the campaign that they used. And what's interesting about this is not only did they reach their goal, they actually exceeded their goal. And I've seen this to be true in a lot of campaigns. When you have something that's compelling, differentiating, and true, every other metric that was that they measured in this ministry, volunteer hours, giving to just general giving, all kinds of things, all increased. And I've seen this before. When you run a campaign that's compelling, it also usually engages people in other parts of the ministry. And then let me show you how the inside looked. So here was the layout that they have. And again, I sat in his office and we marked this up. What I want you to pay particular close attention to is the bottom graph. That's about the centers that they would open. See, that's the features. That's the buildings that they're going to talk about. Quite frankly, that's not anything that I'm that concerned about. The buildings are the means. So what we did is, and again, I wasn't involved in the layout. I was just involved in guiding the principals. So I might do these layouts a little differently. But the difference between this one, which is about centers, and this one is about babies. And the goal is to save 2,400 additional lives by opening 6 new centers by 2006 instead of the normal growth rate of 2010. And that little thought bubble wouldn't be my favorite design choice, but these lives hinge on your decision. If I remember my stats correctly, I think when they were just in the quiet phase, they had raised like half their money. They raised like a 1.5 million. They actually reached their goal well ahead of what they wanted to do. But most importantly, babies' lives were probably saved as a result of this. And so nothing changed in terms of what they did. Not one thing changed, but what changed is the way that they communicated and understanding the motivations. And the people that were passionate about the ministry, they weren't passionate about buildings and centers. They were passionate about being able to step in the gap for babies. And so if you think about this, and this always I'm so grateful that, there were babies that were probably adopted as a result of this, and families were impacted. And, I often wonder where these kids that came about because this campaign was successful, where they're at now. But this is a great example of how you can just take the same thing and communicate much more effectively. And then the last one I want to show you here is the LCMS Foundation. So I had mentioned this earlier in one of the emails. In one of the slides. So the LCMS Foundation is not your typical foundation. It's the Lutheran Missouri Synod. And what they do is they're actually a financial management group. So they manage legacy and estates and things for members of the LCMS. So they don't grant, but they do things. And so they had all your typical instruments, charitable remainder trust, but it was very, very confusing. So what I did is I worked with them to create this big idea of the lifetime plan for giving. That what we want to do is realize that God has given us a heart of generosity because he's a generous God. And so you should think about giving throughout your life. And so this is an example of the brochure that they started out with. Realize your vision for ministry, for mission and ministry. We can help. The foundation customizes service to your need. I'm not even sure what that headline means, realize your vision for ministry, mission and ministry. But here's how we changed it based on understanding the motivations of our audience, the takeaways. Provide for the people you love and the ministries you care about. Resources for your family, support for the Lord's work. Now, and then also there are captions here that show different things. There's kids, there's ministers. And so the key here is that they didn't change one thing that they offered, not one thing. And this will sound like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. In 18 months, because of the communication that we did, they managed 10 times the number of resources in just 18 months because of just communicating more effectively. Now, let me show you the inside of this brochure. This is what it was. This went along with the Realize Vision for Ministry or Realize Your Vision for Ministry and Mission. And so here is their brochure. Now, notice those headlines. It's all about them, the foundation, the foundation, the foundation, the foundation. Have this random group of people. So what we did is we changed it to how can you provide for your heirs and the Lord's work. And then you'll notice the photos are very strategic. There's a photo of building, which is capital project. There's a photo of water, which is relief efforts. People have a heart for that. And then the Lutherans particularly like supporting people for seminary. And so that's the caption, that's the photo on the right. And then there's a very intentional photo in the bottom right-hand side that shows just multi-generational, right? So that you can provide heirs in the Lord's work. And this is the heart of what people who want to do. And so the other thing that you'll notice is the subheads are important too, right? There's a very clear call to action about how to get started there. And it's a phone number. That's what they wanted to start to get the relationship started. And as I said, the results for this were significant. The president at the time of the Missouri, or the foundation, ended up actually taking the presidency of a university. And one of the things he asked is if I could come and help his university go through this process as well too, as they began to figure out how to make a message that was compelling, differentiating, and true. I realize a little bit of this is drinking from a fire hose. But again, what I would really hope you do is just consider these principles and how they would apply. Some of the things you can start to do immediately, like using captions and being selective about your photos. Some of the things are going to take you a little bit longer to work out. But one illustration I often use is that effective marketing communication is more like irrigation than a thunderstorm. Too often people will try and do something, and then they disappear, and they do something, and they create what I call a marketing communication drought. They do some big thing and then they disappear. And what I've seen over time in a lot of different spaces, both ministries, not-for-profits, and individual authors and companies, is you're better off doing a little bit over a long period of time than a big thunderstorm. So think about it that way. It's more like irrigation. And then commit to the principles, not just activity. Sometimes people think if they're active, then they're going to be effective, but actually really be thoughtful about what you do. And then the other thing to remember is that you can't do everything at once. You just can't. And so with the Lutheran Missouri Synod Foundation, we identified what needed to be done, and it took us about a year to actually get everything in place. But the other thing to be encouraged by is you will get better over time. Every time you start to apply these principles, if you go and you look at your first communication versus your communication that you'll do a year from now, you will get better over time. And then the last thing I'll tell you is that the focal group was so encouraged by what I was able to share at the last forum I attended, that I actually have taken their whole team through this communication principles. And so they've actually been applying this over the last year, and they're getting better and better and better. You may not have noticed the difference, but I certainly have. And Greg would tell you that it's made a difference as well too. So what can you do today? Be clear about your promise, understand the motivations of your audience, apply the takeaway, use photo images and captions, make your call to action clear. If you just start doing those things, you will become more effective in your communication.